I don't know the exact percentage, but I'm guessing about 50% of the American colonists thought, all right, man, I'm going to get my tea for half price. But the other half didn't think it was right. Okay, they thought, no, now what they're doing there is they're running the colonial merchants out of business, and we don't think that's right. So many of those colonists that were sympathetic to the business owners decided to react to the East India Company's actions, and this famous reaction occurred in Boston in late 1773. Does anybody know what that reaction was? The Boston Tea Party. We're going to talk about that in just a second. So, again, many colonial merchants were being driven out of business by the acts of the East India Tea Company. Many colonists thought that was great and loved to have their tea at a discounted price. Other colonists who were sympathetic to business owners reacted to the actions of the East India Company, and the most famous reaction to the Tea Act occurred in Boston in late 1773. Anybody know who, you've all heard, yeah, if you haven't heard of the Boston Tea Party, you're not an American. But anyway, everybody's heard of the Boston Tea Party, right? And everybody has a different version. Does anybody know who actually were the people that initiated the Boston Tea Party, that did what they did? You know who did this? Sons of Liberty. Very good. So 100 members of the Sons of Liberty disguised themselves as Indians. Yeah. So the Sons of Liberty did this. Okay? And about 100 of them disguised themselves as Indians. And they boarded 3 British ships that were full of tea, had chests of tea, big chests of tea, and they destroyed 343 chests of tea by doing what? Dumping them into Boston Harbor. Okay? So 100 members of the Sons of Liberty, disguised as Indians, board 3 different British vessels that have chests, big chests, wood chests of tea, and they dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. About 45 tons worth, by the way. That's a lot of tea. Tea's not a heavy item, is it? So 45 tons of tea were in those 342 chests that they dumped into Boston Harbor. 42 tons of tea. Worth many thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And this action became known in history as the Boston Tea Party. So it was the Sons of Liberty that took that action. And the reason we had the Boston Tea Party is why? Because colonists were mad that British merchants, tea merchants, were selling directly to colonists and bypassing colonial merchants, running them out of business. Well, the reason the Sons of Liberty did that was to anger British merchants and Parliament, hoping they would take some aggressive action against the colonists. Now that sounds funny, but there's a purpose behind it. So it was the intention of the Sons of Liberty to anger these British merchants and anger Parliament, so that Parliament would take more aggressive action against the colonists. So what the Sons of Liberty are doing is trying to inflict self-inflicted pain, right? They're doing this so that the Parliament will do something that will be more painful to the colonies. Why would they do that? Why would they shoot themselves in the foot, Cody?
If they aggravate the colonists, then they will rebel against Great Britain and hopefully get closer to them.
And you said?
They want to start a revolution.
They want to start a revolution. They want to start getting all American colonists mad at the British. Were all American colonists mad at the British? No. We're going to have loyalists throughout the entire Revolutionary War when we get to there. We're going to have troubles in the southern part of the United States because most of the people who live down there are southern farmers that are doing really well under British rule. And they're not interested in independence because it's going to screw them up. And we have loyalists that we deal with throughout the Revolutionary War even. So the aggressive action on the part of the British would hopefully lead all colonists questioning the actions of the British government against the colonies. Now, the Boston Tea Party, if you look at all 13 colonies, the actions of the Sons of Liberty and the Boston Tea Party brought out mixed reactions. Not everybody felt the same way about the actions that the Sons of Liberty took. Some colonists approved of destroying all that tea, while others knew if you do that, what's going to happen? There's going to be more repercussions and more things that we're not going to like. So some people thought the actions of the Sons of Liberty were great. Man, that's awesome. We'll kick butt on those British. Others thought, geez, are you stupid? Don't you understand by doing this type of thing, all you're going to do is put more repercussions upon us, and they're just going to stick it to us even more? So some colonists approved of the tea's destruction, while other colonists knew there would be serious repercussions from the British government. Well, these repercussions turned out to be something called the Intolerable Acts. And that's our next subtopic. So this, how British reacts to the Boston Tea Party, will be the Intolerable Acts. The name alone should tell you that they're not going to be very fun for the colonies. The Intolerable Acts of 1774. Well, as you can imagine, the Sons of Liberty accomplished their goal in the fact that British officials and English merchants were just furious at the actions of colonists during the Boston Tea Party. They accomplished their goal very much. And as a result, the British Parliament passed 4 new laws that are going to be known as the Intolerable Acts of 1774. The British Parliament is going to pass 4 new laws that are going to be known as the Intolerable Acts of 1774. Now, the only reason they passed these 4 laws, they being Parliament, was to simply strengthen their control over the American colonies, especially which particular one where all this business was going on. Well, Massachusetts, you're right. So the Intolerable Acts were simply passed to let the colonies know who was boss, especially Massachusetts, because that's where most of this protesting was coming from. Anybody remember how many soldiers were in Boston already? 1 for every 5 people. It'd be like having 80 SROs in this building for this school. There were 4,000. Remember that? There were 4,000 soldiers in Boston. 1 for every 5 citizens. We compared it to this particular school having 80 police officers here. Before they passed these 4 laws, called the Intolerable Acts, Great Britain sent an additional 4,000 troops to Boston, which meant it would be the same as having 160 police officers in here to watch 450 students. Yeah.
Didn't they have to ship them all out because of the Boston Massacre, though?
Is it what?
The Boston Massacre? Didn't they ask for them to be removed?
Yeah, but they did. But they didn't do it.
Oh,
Yeah, very good. They
yeah,
only
yeah.
got the trials. That's a very good point. Good point, though. So now you have 8,000 British soldiers in Boston. And again, think about that. That'd be like having 160 police officers in the school. It'd almost be like having another, it'd be more than having another class. It'd be like the seniors, juniors, sophomores, freshmen, and police officers. It'd be about the same population in each one, okay? Now, basically, as I mentioned, these 4 laws that I'm going to talk about that made up the Intolerable Acts were simply passed to show the colonists, quote, who is boss, okay? Law 1. This is what Law 1 and underline. Law 1. What the British Parliament did is they closed the port of Boston to all shipping. That hurt a little bit, wouldn't it? Closed the port of Boston, closed Boston Harbor to all shipping. Until when, Mr. Bauer? When would they open that harbor? Think simply. What, you were going to close your harbor until you do what? Pay for what? All that tea you dumped into the harbor. Okay? So we're going to close. Now, law number 1 is the British Parliament closed the port of Boston to all shipping until the colonists paid for all the tea they had dumped into Boston Harbor. Law number 2. They revoked the British Charter, C-H-A-R-T-E-R. They revoked the British Charter in Massachusetts. This is something we'll see if you can figure out what that means. They revoked the British Charter in Massachusetts. Pudge, what do you think that means, if they revoked their charter? If it was a British charter, it was something that Britain had to give to Massachusetts probably way back, maybe even 100 years ago. What did they give? When people settled the New World, the British came from New England way back and settled the New World. They were given a British charter. What was that?
Passage over.
And the right to govern themselves. Okay? You had to get a British charter before you could set up a colony in America. Well, Law 2 was Parliament took away that British charter, which meant that who's going to govern Massachusetts from now on? Parliament. Okay? Remember, each of these colonies kind of had their own assemblies and governments, right? Under the umbrella of the British Parliament. But in this case, Law 2, they took away the charter that they had given Massachusetts 100 years ago, meaning they would no longer have the right to govern themselves. That was a big one. So, who has to be named governor of Massachusetts? Somebody from Great Britain. And just so happened that General Thomas Gage, who is the commander of all these British troops in Boston, is going to be the new governor of Boston, and Parliament from this point on will run the colony of Massachusetts. That stung hard. That was a bad one. So we understand that? So what the second law was Parliament took away the British Charter in Massachusetts, which means that Parliament would now govern that colony. And they appointed General Thomas Gage, who was the overall commander of the army in Boston, as governor of Massachusetts. Law number 3. They reissued the Quartering Act of 1765, meaning that the people of Boston and Massachusetts would be responsible to house and feed those 8,000 British soldiers that were in Boston. Okay? So they reissued the Quartering Act of 1765, requiring the colonists to provide food and housing for the British soldiers that were sent to America to enforce all these new laws.
They probably had to do that because of all the soldiers.
But they didn't want it. Do you think the Bostonians wanted to house and feed those guys? No. And the fourth law stated, and we kind of talked about this, if any British official or any British soldier was charged with a crime in the colonies, such as those 8 guys in the Boston Massacre, those 8 soldiers, they would not be tried in the colonies, they would be taken back to Great Britain. That was the fourth law. Any British official or any British soldier who was convicted, not convicted, who was accused of a crime, arrested for a crime, or put on trial for a crime, would not be tried in the colonies. They would be sent back to Great Britain. So it provided that any British official or soldier that was charged with a crime would be taken back to Great Britain rather to be tried in the colonies. Well, do you think that the American colonists protested these intolerable acts? And the way they did it is our next subtopic, the Suffolk Resolves. The Suffolk Resolves. This particular topic was actually on the AP test 2 years ago. The Suffolk Resolves. You had to explain those. Where does it get the name Suffolk Resolves, Suffolk? Well, to protest the Intolerable Acts in Massachusetts, delegates from Boston and other surrounding towns met in Suffolk County, Massachusetts, to discuss their options as far as the Intolerable Acts go. Who are the Intolerable Acts really targeting? Every colony? Massachusetts. Okay? So delegates from all over Massachusetts, Boston and other surrounding towns, met in Suffolk County to discuss their options about these Intolerable Acts. That's where you get the name Suffolk Resolves, because they met in Suffolk County, Massachusetts. These meetings went from September 6th, 1774 through September 9th, 1774. These meetings were held from September 6th, 1774 through September 9th, 1774. There you go. Isn't that something? 1774, 84, 94, 2004, 2014. How long ago was that? Was it 300 years ago? Is it 2074 yet? 250 some years ago, right? Now, who led the meetings? Come on, really impress me. Who led these meetings? Good guess. Samuel Adams is a good guess, but not right. No, good guess, but not right. Come on. Who's the founding father? No one knows.
Mark Wahlberg.
No.
Doctor.
Dr. Joseph Warren. Dr. Joseph Warren led the meetings, which resulted in a series of resolutions that became known in history as the Suffolk Resolves. So between September 6, 1774 through September 9, 1774, these delegates from Boston and other surrounding towns in Massachusetts met, and Dr. Joseph Warren led the meetings. And during those 3 days, those delegates came up with a series of resolutions that became known in American history as the Suffolk Resolves. And these resolutions, basically what resolutions do is they make statements, your viewpoints on what you're arguing about. And here are the six statements that these resolutions made concerning the Intolerable Acts. Number one, the first resolution stated that the Intolerable Acts were unconstitutional and therefore void. The first resolution or first feeling of these delegates were that the Intolerable Acts were unconstitutional and therefore void. The second resolution called for the resignation of all officials in charge of enforcing the Intolerable Acts. The second resolution stated or called for the resignation of all officials in charge of enforcing the Intolerable Acts. So who they want to resign? All members of Parliament? How about those military personnel that are there enforcing? Okay, etc. British officials in America should all resign. Good luck with that one. The third resolution stated that Massachusetts should establish a separate state away from the colonies. In other words, they wouldn't be part of the 13 colonies. They would have their own individual state outside the colonies. The resolution urged Massachusetts to establish a free separate state, because they're the one taking all the heat, are they not? The fourth resolution stated that any taxes in Massachusetts would be collected by Massachusetts tax officials, not British tax officials. The fourth resolution stated that future tax collections be collected by Massachusetts officials and not by British officials. The fifth one The resolution called for the boycott of British goods and trading with Great Britain altogether. More serious than the non-importation acts because they only meant that the merchants wouldn't trade, right, or buy. This meant every single citizen would refuse to buy any British goods or have any goods brought in. That would be in Massachusetts. So the resolution called for the boycott of all citizens in Massachusetts to boycott British goods and stop all trading with Great Britain. All of the citizens, not just the merchants. And the last one was kind of the most interesting. What else might they do that they have not done we haven't even talked about? All we talked about is British military.
They get their own military.
There we go. The sixth resolution stated that the people of Massachusetts should appoint militia officers and commence arming local citizens. In other words, create a Massachusetts militia. So the sixth statement or resolution, the Suffolk Resolve, stated that the people of Massachusetts would appoint militia officers and commence arming local forces. Now, this is kind of the start. When we get into the Revolutionary War, by the time we get to that point, kiddos, almost every single colony is going to have their own what? Militia. So when General Washington puts together this Continental Army, he will get a lot of those people, but still he will be fighting with local militia. Have you ever seen the movie what's it called? Tip of my tongue. That Mel Gibson was in. The Patriot. How many people have seen the movie The Patriot?
Oh yeah, I love that movie.
He led the local militia there and helped aid